Individuation, the cure for enmeshment. I hope it is clear by now what enmeshment is. It is a weak state, a state of bondage and dependence. Nick Reiner represents well the symptoms of that state and that dynamic. Dysfunction, depression, destruction, a ruin that begins with a fragmented mindset. The experts refer to this splintered mentality as schizophrenia, but it is sufficient to simply see it as a disintegrated self. Well, what is the cure then? If a disintegrated self becomes enmeshed, weakened, addicted, with no sense of self and no identity, what is the cure?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
While the cure to a disintegrated self is an integrated mindset, an integrated self. So what is individuation? It is both a simple singular process and also an incredibly complex, very difficult process, a journey really that takes you most, if not all, of your natural life. It is also something no one really achieves, not fully anyway. A good way to understand individuation is through fiction. If I didn't tell you any more than this, you probably would still understand the concept in a granular sense. Famous fictional characters that are fully or almost fully individuated are, for example, Luke Skywalker.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that is farthest from.
Another example of a supremely individuated character is Frodo Baggins from The Lord of the Rings.
I know what I must do. It's just, I'm afraid to do it.
These are not characters that are heroes to begin with. It's the arc of their story, the growth and development of these ordinary people into fully fledged human beings, which is basically the hero's journey. Now, what about true blue historical figures? Uhtred of Bebbanburg is an interesting semi-fictitious character that we see in The Last Kingdom, an excellent series on Netflix.
Follow me and I will take you down a hard, brutal path. But it is a path that leads to the one thing every true warrior desires. Reputation.
There's actually a fantastic dynamic in the first 2 episodes of The Last Kingdom where Uhtred's own father isn't particularly nice to him. And he is then kidnapped by the Danes, he loses his birthright, and a leader, Lord Ragnar, grows so fond of him that when Uhtred's uncle, who doesn't like him either, reluctantly offers to ransom him, Uhtred's kidnapper pays the ransom instead so that he can keep him. And so, if anything, we see in a short space of time, someone has found Uhtred to be very valuable, and this imbues the young boy with incredible self-belief, which leads to an incredible journey of individuation, all against the canvas of Wessex and a country forming 1,000 years ago. It's a story skillfully crafted by Bernard Cornwell. And Cornwell, who was also adopted, just like Luke Skywalker is adopted, wrote The Last Kingdom because he discovered he was related to Uhtred the Bold. His story, which is based on a true story, sets the stage for one of the most important moments that led to the civilized world as we know it today. Now, like Luke Skywalker, Uhtred is orphaned at an early age, but quickly demonstrates his potential and also wins the approval of an important priest, which soon leads to an audience with a powerful king. That is quite a journey, from a child in this obscure situation with no prospects to a hero finding himself in the company of kings, and in Luke Skywalker's case, the most important person in the galaxy. Now, if we consider Nick Reiner's kingdom to be Hollywood, he basically failed to make it past the gates of his guest house into Brentwood. Nick Reiner didn't have the ear of a priest. He was still living, still enmeshed with his parents, and his only claim to fame was a dubious pet project that he leaned heavily on his father's talents to achieve and leaned on his father's name to execute that particular project, only for that to be an unmitigating disaster, much like Nick himself. And interestingly, that was really a story about Nick, and no one really cared about it because there's nothing heroic about it. Now, it may seem in fiction that heroes have a straight shot to the top of the heap with no setbacks. Nelson Mandela, who started life as a shepherd boy in the Transkei, became a lawyer, served 27 years in prison. How is that for a setback before becoming president? He's another excellent example of a truly individuated person, a person who reaches or almost achieves their full potential. Those who achieve this are invariably incredibly inspiring people, and their stories we feel are heroic in their practical demonstrations of wherewithal, resilience, discipline, and perhaps above all, not losing heart and overcoming adversity. What we most admire in these individuals is their ability to seemingly magically transcend their circumstances. Whereas Nick Reiner was wallowing in self-pity, overweight, addicted, spoiled, coddled, blaming others, and filled with hate, including towards those who were helping him the most. I would say the key ingredient to enmeshment is self-pity and people responding to that self-pity. And self-pity is also kryptonite as far as individuation is concerned, because the opposite of self-pity is courage. The opposite of stagnation is action, and you need courage to take action. The opposite of escapism is facing reality. And facing reality, including the reality of oneself, requires courage, because reality is hard. I think the first step on the road to individuation is arguably this, and I remember reading it in a book called The Road Not Taken many, many years ago, and it goes like this. Life is difficult. This is the great truth, one of the greatest truths. It is a great truth because once we see it, we transcend it. Seeing this truth means accepting it, and I suspect Nick and many drug addicts like him can't or won't accept a truth like that because they feel their station in life ought to make life easier, and that's what makes their life so hard, so empty, and so meaningless, is this expectation that life must be easy, not the acceptance that life is hard. M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Not Taken, and incidentally, the road he writes about not taking, that's the narrow path, the hero's journey. That's also the path Nick didn't take. Anyway, Scott Peck later added, as an addendum to this topic, he said, I do not think that everybody has to struggle, but to probably at least half of the people, it never seems to enter their minds that they might be engaged in a struggle or that there might be something to struggle with. In Nick Reiner's case, if he had recognized that he had something to struggle against, almost like a climber knows that he has a mountain to climb, this would have been 99% of the problem and 99% of the solution, I feel. But imagine a climber who wants to get to the top, but without actually learning the ropes, without actually using the ropes, without actually acknowledging that there's a mountain under the top of the mountain. You can't get to the top without starting at the bottom. Not for an authentic journey anyway. Some of the most powerful stories of individuation for me are the stories from elite athletes, perhaps because their struggling and their suffering is so blatantly obvious. They train, they get injured, they are disappointed, sometimes they fall, sometimes they get sick. One athlete I watch who has already had an incredible story is the 2024 Ironman World Champion and the 2025 70.3 Ironman World Champion Lucy Charles Barkley. In fact, last year Lucy did something that was surprising, I think, even for her. After suffering one of the worst crash and burn disasters of her career, she actually pulled out of the Hawaii Ironman World Championship in Kona. She couldn't even finish it. She was wobbling and barely able to even stand. And then guess what? She bounces back 4 weeks later and wins the very next World Championship in Marbella, Spain. How was she able to do this? Well, not because she felt sorry for herself, but because of the opposite, because she believed in herself regardless. You will see with elite athletes just how effortlessly they transcend pain, suffering, and struggle. Instead, they seek out ways to test themselves. They seek out terrain that will test them. They jump into ice baths that will train at high altitude. They lift heavy weights or puncture their bodies to make sure that their lactate is at the right level. They expose themselves to wind tunnels to make those incremental gains needed. In other words, they try and put themselves into realities that are going to challenge them. They don't try and avoid those realities. And one thing you don't see among champions is self-pity or complaining or blaming anyone or anything. Also, they are not addicted to anything. Obsessed, yes. Hyper-focused, yes. Addicted, no. What you see instead is discipline, boundaries, focus, and a tireless work ethic. With Nick Reiner, what we see is a vast laziness, which is the opposite of a work ethic. The laziness that comes with a coddled upbringing, the entropy that sometimes arises out of privilege, and the restless pursuit of trying to avoid the unpleasant niggles of the real world. Now let me ask you, instead of despising Nick Reiner or blaming Nick for what he did to his parents, let me ask you, what journey are you on? Think about it. What adventure into becoming, what struggle are you working on each day, every day? And how goes your journey towards individuation? Well, I'd love to hear your answers in the comments. If you don't have an answer to that, that's something you need to find and work out for yourself. Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. This has been, I guess, an unusual analysis in terms of this case, but I think quite an important one. If you found it interesting, meaningful, and worthwhile, please do hit the thanks button, and I'll see you guys next time.